On December 18, 2025, a Cessna Citation 550 departed Statesville Regional Airport in North Carolina carrying 7 souls. 10 minutes later, all 7 were dead. Among them was NASCAR legend Greg Biffle, his wife Christina, and their 2 children, 14-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Ryder. The aircraft never made it above 4,500 feet. In the final 5 seconds of recorded data, the jet's airspeed dropped from 107 knots to 93 knots. For a citation on final approach, that number should send chills down your spine. The question haunting investigators isn't what happened, it's why. Let me take you through what we know. The morning of December 18th started like any other holiday trip. Greg Biffle, the 56-year-old retired NASCAR champion with 19 Cup Series wins to his name, was flying his family to Sarasota, Florida. The aircraft was a 1981 Cessna Citation 550, registration November 257 Bravo Whiskey, owned through Biffle's company, GB Aviation Leasing. At the controls was Dennis Dutton, a 67-year-old retired Delta Airlines captain with over 17,000 flight hours. His type ratings included the Airbus A320, A330, A350, Boeing 737, 757, 767, and the DC-10. He also held a type rating for the CE 500 series, which includes the Citation 550. In the right seat sat his 20-year-old son Jack, a private pilot with just 175 hours of flight time, all in single-engine aircraft. This detail would later become critical. Also aboard was Craig Wadsworth, a close family friend. Weather conditions at Statesville showed 5 miles visibility with heavy drizzle and a broken ceiling at 1,200 feet above ground level. A routine departure under visual flight rules with plans to pick up their instrument clearance once airborne. The problems began before they even left the ground. During engine start, the left engine initially failed to start before both power plants finally came online around 9:53 in the morning. While taxiing, the cockpit voice recorder captured a discussion between the 3 pilots aboard about an inoperative thrust reverser indicator light. They concluded a reverser itself was working properly, just the indication was faulty. During the takeoff roll, Biffle, seated in the cabin behind the cockpit, observed that the left engine appeared to be producing more power than the right. He suggested it might be a faulty gauge. The crew continued the takeoff. At approximately 10:06, the Citation lifted off runway 10 and began climbing into the overcast. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Shortly after departure, Jack Dutton attempted to contact Atlanta Center 3 times to activate their instrument flight rules clearance. Each attempt failed. Controllers were too busy with other traffic to respond. The jet made a left turn to the west and climbed. Around 10:09, there was discussion between Dennis Dutton and Biffle about climbing to a higher altitude, even though they were technically required to remain in visual conditions. At that moment, the aircraft had descended to about 1,580 feet and was traveling at 164 knots. As Dennis initiated a climb, Biffle noticed something concerning. He called out a difference between the left and right engine interstage turbine temperature indications, but there was no further discussion about it. At 10:10, everything started falling apart. The cockpit area microphone captured Dennis making remarks that his altitude indicator wasn't working properly. Additional left-side flight instruments appeared to be malfunctioning as well. Around the same time, the aircraft's Garmin GTN 750 navigation unit stopped recording airspeed data. Moments later, heading data also disappeared. The autopilot either disengaged on its own or was intentionally disconnected. Then something unusual happened. At an altitude of 4,500 feet, Dennis transferred control of the aircraft to his son, Jack. The cockpit voice recorder captured severe audio degradation lasting more than 3 minutes, suggesting possible electrical anomalies. When audio quality returned, a passenger, likely Biffle, asked about power to the alternator. Here's the thing. The Cessna Citation 550 doesn't have an alternator. It uses starter generators. This detail reveals the confusion in that cockpit as they tried to troubleshoot an unfolding electrical emergency. Dennis responded that whatever the passenger mentioned was the problem, but he never elaborated on what specifically was wrong or what could be done about it. After that exchange, there were no further recorded discussions about instrument malfunctions. By 10:13, The aircraft had descended to approximately 1,900 feet. All three pilot-rated occupants reported they could see the ground. Control was transferred back to Dennis. The decision had been made to abandon the trip to Florida and return to Statesville. They began configuring for landing on runway 28. Dennis requested flaps extended, then called for the landing gear.
But the gear indicator lights wouldn't illuminate. Was the gear actually down? They couldn't be sure. At this point, Jack Dutton transmitted on the airport's common traffic advisory frequency with words that would become haunting. He said simply, "We're having some issues here." The citation was on a right base turn to runway 28 when it rolled out aligned with final approach at 1,240 feet and 114 knots. For the next 30 seconds, the aircraft continued descending toward the runway threshold. But the airspeed wasn't holding. GPS data showed it bleeding off steadily. In the final 5 seconds of recorded data, the indicated airspeed increased briefly to 107 knots, then dropped rapidly to 93 knots.
For perspective, the reference landing speed for a Citation 550 at typical landing weight is around 106 knots. At 93 knots, they were deep into the danger zone. The first impact point was a 29-foot-tall approach light structure located approximately 1,380 feet short of the runway threshold. The aircraft tore through the light station, continued through a group of trees that were sheared about 12 feet above ground level, then carved a ground impression near the airport perimeter fence before sliding through the runway overrun area. When it finally came to rest in the runway blast area, a post-impact fire erupted and consumed the majority of the fuselage. All 7 occupants perished. Now let's examine the theories that have emerged from this tragedy. The first and most widely discussed is electrical system failure. The evidence for this is substantial. Multiple instruments on the pilot's side stopped functioning. The Garmin unit lost airspeed and heading data intermittently. The severe audio degradation on the cockpit voice recorder suggests something was seriously wrong with electrical power. The confusion about the alternator, despite the aircraft not having one, points to the crew grasping for explanations as systems failed around them. The landing gear indicator lights not illuminating despite the gear apparently being configured adds another data point. All of these symptoms could stem from a generator failure, an inverter malfunction, or a bus fault that starved critical instruments of power. What argues against this being the sole cause is that the right side instruments appeared to be functioning normally when Jack took the controls. If both generators had failed, both sides would have been affected equally. The second theory involves weight and balance. This is where the concept of center of gravity becomes relevant. Every aircraft has an envelope within which its center of gravity must fall for safe flight. Too far forward and the aircraft becomes nose-heavy, requiring excessive elevator authority to maintain level flight. Too far aft, and something much more dangerous happens. An aft center of gravity makes an aircraft increasingly nose-up sensitive and dramatically reduces stall recovery margins. In extreme cases, if the CG is beyond the aft limit, the aircraft can pitch up violently and become unrecoverable from a stall. The Citation 550 was carrying 7 occupants plus full fuel that December morning. The seating arrangement matters enormously. Biffle was positioned near the cockpit in the cabin area. Where were Christina, Emma, Ryder, and Craig Wadsworth seated? If passengers and baggage were loaded toward the rear of the cabin, the center of gravity could have been pushed aft of acceptable limits. What makes this theory intriguing is the final moments of flight data. The airspeed bled off to 93 knots, well below reference speed. When throttles were found in the full forward position in the wreckage, it suggested the pilot recognized the sink rate and attempted a go-around, or at least tried to arrest the descent. But if the CG was too far aft, that power application, combined with the nose-up pitch, could have pushed the aircraft past the critical angle of attack, with no way to recover. The counterargument is that we have no evidence of improper loading. Dennis Dutton was an enormously experienced pilot who would have been familiar with weight and balance calculations. The third theory, and perhaps the most overlooked, centers on crew qualification and workload saturation. This is uncomfortable to discuss because it touches on human factors rather than mechanical failure. but it demands examination. Dennis Dutton held an airline transport pilot certificate with a type rating for the CE 500 series. However, that rating came with a critical limitation. Federal regulations required him to operate the Citation 550 with a qualified second-in-command. Jack Dutton, despite holding a private pilot certificate, was not qualified to serve as second-in-command on this aircraft. He had no multi-engine time, he had no jet experience, he had no type rating. Under Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 61.55, he simply didn't meet the requirements. What this meant operationally was that when the emergency began, Dennis Dutton was effectively alone in managing it. Yes, Jack could handle radio calls and run checklists, but when it came to troubleshooting complex electrical failures, managing a deteriorating weather situation, flying a precise approach, and configuring an aircraft with unreliable indications, Dennis was carrying that entire workload himself. Aviation safety experts call this task saturation. It's when the demands of the situation exceed the crew's capacity to manage them. Every pilot who has analyzed this accident has the same thought: fly the airplane first. But when your instruments are failing, your co-pilot can't truly help, weather is closing in, and your family is in the cabin behind you, maintaining that discipline becomes almost superhuman. Let me walk you through what the investigation has established and what remains unknown. The NTSB recovered the cockpit voice recorder and extracted approximately 31 minutes of audio, though poor quality hampered portions of the analysis. The aircraft was not required to carry a flight data recorder, so investigators had to rely on limited GPS data from the Garmin unit and external ADS-B tracking. Both engines remained attached to the airframe after impact. Damage patterns indicated they were producing power at the moment of impact. There was no evidence of uncontained engine failure or pre-impact structural failure. The throttles were found in the full forward position. The thrust reversers were stowed. What we don't know is equally important. We don't know the exact nature of the electrical malfunction. We don't know what specifically caused the left side instruments to fail while the right side remained functional. We don't know if the landing gear was actually extended, only that the indicator lights weren't working. We don't know the aircraft's precise center of gravity at the time of the accident. And we may never know exactly what was going through Dennis Dutton's mind as he tried to save everyone aboard. Consider what the pilot was managing in those final minutes. He had multiple instrument failures on his side of the cockpit. He had intermittent or no airspeed and heading data from the Garmin. He had an autopilot that had disconnected. He had deteriorating weather pushing toward instrument conditions, while he had no IFR clearance and couldn't raise ATC. He had an unqualified pilot in the right seat who could assist with basic tasks, but not share the cognitive load of managing the emergency. He had 6 passengers, including 2 children, depending on him. He made the decision to return to the airport rather than continue to Florida. He successfully maneuvered the aircraft back to Statesville. He got the runway in sight. He was aligned with final approach. He was so close to saving everyone. But somewhere, in those final 30 seconds, the energy state of the aircraft dropped below what was survivable. Whether it was an aft CG making the stall unrecoverable, whether it was distraction causing him to let the airspeed decay too far, whether it was spatial disorientation from partial instrument failures, or whether it was some combination we haven't yet identified, that 1,380 feet between where they impacted and the runway threshold represents one of aviation's cruelest margins. For pilots watching this, the lessons are both simple and profound. Fly the airplane first, last, and always. When systems are failing around you, your primary job is to maintain aircraft control. Airspeed, altitude, heading. Everything else is secondary. Know your aircraft's electrical system intimately. Understand what fails when a generator drops offline. Know which instruments are on which bus. Practice partial panel procedures until they're automatic. Respect the regulations around crew qualifications. They exist because emergencies demand competent help in both seats. If your type rating requires a qualified SIC, that requirement isn't bureaucratic paperwork. It's there because solo management of complex failures in high-performance aircraft exceeds human capacity. And always, Always know your weight and balance. It takes minutes to calculate and can mean the difference between an aircraft that responds to your inputs and one that betrays you at the worst possible moment. The aviation community lost more than a NASCAR legend that December morning. We lost a father who used his own helicopter to rescue hurricane victims just months earlier. We lost a mother and 2 children with their whole lives ahead of them. We lost a retired airline captain who had safely flown millions of passengers over his career. We lost his son, a young aviation student at Auburn University who was building toward his own flying career. We lost a family friend who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The families gathering at Sarasota who never saw them arrive carry a grief that no analysis can address. What we owe them is a thorough investigation, honest answers about what went wrong, and changes that might prevent the next tragedy. The NTSB's final report won't be released until late 2026 or 2027. When it comes, we'll revisit this accident with whatever new information emerges. Until then, we have preliminary data, theories, and questions. We have a flight that lasted 10 minutes and ended 1,300 feet short of safety. We have the final transmission from a young man who probably didn't fully understand what was happening. We're having some issues here. In aviation, we study accidents not to assign blame, but to prevent recurrence. Every crash represents a failure in some system, whether mechanical, procedural, or human. Our responsibility is to learn what we can and carry those lessons forward. For Greg Biffle, his family, and everyone aboard November 257 Bravo Whiskey, that's the only tribute that truly matters. Fly safe out there.